My phone buzzed at 10:40 on a Thursday morning while I was standing on a job site with mud on my boots and a subcontractor asking me questions I hadn't finished answering yet. I held up one finger to the subcontractor and looked at the screen. It was my brother Ray. A direct message, not the group chat. Astra's family meeting Sunday at Mom's. You don't need to come. We'll loop you in after. Trust me on this one. Asterisk. I read it twice. The subcontractor was still waiting. I told him I'd call him back in 5 and walked to my truck. I opened the family group chat. Ray had posted there too, 20 minutes before the message he'd sent me. Same meeting, same Sunday, same address. A time. A note about parking on the street because the driveway would be full. My sister had already replied with a thumbs up. My cousin had sent a see you then. My uncle had written I'll bring chairs. Everyone had a time and an address. I had you don't need to come. I sat in my truck and read both messages again, back to back, the group one and then mine. The subcontractor knocked on my window. I started the truck instead of answering it, pulled to the edge of the site, and sat there with the engine running and my brother's words on the screen in front of me. Trust me on this one. I thought about what it would take for a man to send his brother that sentence and feel good about it. To sit there and type it out and hit send and go back to whatever he was doing. Sunday was 4 days away. The shop on 3rd Street had my father's name on the sign and my fingerprints on everything else. I'm Jason, 36 years old, the son who stayed. I started working beside my dad when I was 24 and never really stopped. Evenings after my regular job, Saturdays, holidays when the heat went out or a customer had a situation that couldn't wait. 11 years of that before he died, and then 6 months of doing it without him, which was a different kind of work entirely. His name was Walt. He built the place from a single bay, and he used lift and 30 years of knowing how to treat people right. When he died in March, it was sudden enough that nobody had time to prepare anything. Not the paperwork, not the staff, not the plan. I kept the doors open because closing them felt like something I wasn't authorized to do without his permission. The 3 mechanics who worked there had known my father longer than I had. We didn't talk about it much. We just kept showing up. My brother Ryan flew in for the funeral in a dark suit that still had the tag tucked inside the sleeve. I noticed it during the service and didn't say anything because what would I say? He hugged everyone the right number of times and said the right things and stayed 4 days and then flew back to the city where he worked in some kind of financial consulting that I'd never fully understood despite him explaining it twice. He called our mother every Sunday after that. She mentioned it to me in the way she mentioned things she thought were sweet. He was checking in. He was worried about her. He was asking gentle questions about how she was managing. She said gentle questions like it was a comfort. I heard it differently. The week before the meeting, Ryan came by the shop on a Tuesday afternoon without calling first. I was in the 2nd bay doing a brake job when I heard the door and came out wiping my hands, and there he was, walking slowly through the space with his hands in his pockets, looking at things the way people look at things when they're estimating. He smiled when he saw me. Ray had a good smile. He'd always had a good smile. Place looked solid, he said. Dad kept it tight. Yeah, I said. He drifted toward the back wall, where we kept the older equipment, looked up at the ceiling, looked at the floor. Then he turned back to me with the expression of someone thinking out loud. Hey, out of curiosity, he said, what do you think the property's worth? Like the building, the lot. Ballpark. I looked at him. Why? He shrugged. Just thinking about the estate stuff. Trying to get a picture of everything. Mom's going to have to deal with all of it eventually, and I want to help her understand what she's got. I gave him a number that was vague enough to be useless. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something rather than avoided it. Smart, he said. Don't tell anyone else that number yet. He said it casually, like advice between brothers, and then he looked at his phone and said he had to get back to Mom's for dinner and he'd see me Sunday. After he left, I stood in the bay for a while. The mechanic closest to me, a guy named Pete who'd worked for my father for 15 years, came around the corner and glanced at the door Ryan had just walked out of. Who was that? He said. My brother. Pete looked at the door a second longer than necessary. Then he went back to what he was doing without saying anything else, which told me everything about what the visit had felt like from the outside. Don't tell anyone else that number yet. Now don't worry about it. Now I'll handle the paperwork. Tell no one. As if a number I owned a share of was something I needed his permission to discuss. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the week. I was still thinking about it on Thursday when the text came through. My mother made soup for lunch on Wednesday because she made soup when she didn't know what else to do, and she'd been making it most days since March. I sat at the same kitchen table I'd sat at my whole life and watched her move around the kitchen the way she did now, a little slower, stopping sometimes in the middle of a task like she'd lost the thread of it. She was 61, and she looked more tired than 61 should look. Grief had a way of adding years to a person that had nothing to do with age. We talked about the shop for a while. She asked about Pete and the others, whether business had held, whether I was eating enough. The usual thing she asked because they were safe and because asking them meant she didn't have to sit still with a bigger thing underneath. Then she mentioned Ryan. He's been so helpful, she said, setting a bowl down in front of me. Going through all your father's paperwork. There's so much of it, I wouldn't even know where to start. What kind of paperwork? I said. Business things. The estate. He found some things that need to be decided soon, he said. She sat down across from me and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. He'll explain it all Sunday. Mom, what things? She looked at me with the particular expression she used when she wanted the world to be simpler than it was. I don't understand most of it, Jason. That's why Ryan's helping. He knows about these things. I didn't push it. She was 61 and exhausted, and she wanted someone to handle it. And Ryan had shown up offering to do exactly that. And I understood why she'd said yes. I understood it, and I still felt it like something tightening in my chest. I drove back to the shop after lunch and worked until evening, and then Sarah called. She was 2 hours away, and she'd always been the one who tried to stand in the middle of things, not out of weakness, but out of genuine belief that the middle was survivable. She was 32 and careful with her words in a way that Ryan had always called diplomatic and I had always called exhausted. You ready for Sunday? She said. I was told not to come. The pause was long enough that I could hear her breathing change. What do you mean you were told not to come? Ray sent me a direct message. Said I didn't need to be there. They'd loop me in after. Another pause. Jason, he told me you'd already agreed to let him handle it. That you were too busy with the shop and didn't want to deal with the family stuff right now. I sat with that for a second. He said I agreed. Those were his words. He said you two had talked, and you were on the same page. Sarah, he hasn't had a real conversation with me in 3 weeks. The last time I saw him, he came by the shop and asked me what the property was worth. She went quiet again, and I let her be quiet because she was working something out and she needed the space to do it. Something's wrong, she said finally. Not a question. Yeah. After we hung up, I sat in my truck outside the shop for a few minutes, and then I went back inside and walked through the dark front office and into my father's office at the back and turned on the desk lamp. The filing cabinet was a 2-drawer gray metal thing my father had owned since before I was born. I knew every folder in it. We'd restructured the business 2 years ago. My father and I sat with an attorney on a Tuesday afternoon and had the paperwork drawn up properly. The incorporation documents naming me as co-owner. I'd signed them. My father had signed them. I'd watched him put them in the cabinet myself. I opened the drawer and found the folder. It was labeled in my father's handwriting, the blocky, careful print he used for anything official. The folder was there. The papers were not. I stood in that office with the empty folder in my hand and the desk lamp throwing its small circle of light across my father's desk, and I thought about Ryan walking through the bays with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ceiling, looking at the floor, estimating. I called Ryan Thursday morning from the shop office, early, before the first car came in. He picked up on the second ring, sounding like a man who had already been awake for hours and was managing several things at once. Hey, he said. What's up? What's the meeting about? A half-beat. Then the easy tone, smooth and unhurried. It's just an update from Mom. Estate stuff, really. Boring paperwork. You'd hate it honestly. That's why I figured you didn't need to sit through the whole thing. Sarah said you told her I'd already agreed to let you handle it." He laughed. It was a good laugh, natural sounding, the kind that makes you feel like you're the one being unreasonable. "You know how Sarah is. She gets things mixed up sometimes. I probably said you were focused on the shop, and she turned that into something else." "Ryan." "Jason, I'm trying to make this easier for Mom. That's all this is." The incorporation papers are gone from the filing cabinet. The half-second of quiet that followed was small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't listening for it. I was listening for it. "Oh yeah," he said. "I grabbed those. I needed copies for the accountant. I should have told you. I'll bring them back Sunday." "Which accountant?" "Martian someone. I'll text you the name." "Text it now." "I'm in the middle of something. I'll send it later." He didn't send it later. I checked my phone at noon, and again at 3, and again at 6. Nothing. I sent him a single message that said still waiting on that name, and got back a thumbs-up reaction on the message, which was the kind of response that meant he'd seen it and decided a thumbs-up was sufficient. Mid-afternoon, Pete came into the office and leaned against the door frame with the expression he used when he wasn't sure how to start a sentence. "Something you should probably know," he said. "This morning before you got in, guy came by in a suit. Didn't come inside. He was out front taking photos of the building from across the street. Then he walked the edge of the lot and wrote some things down." "Did he talk to anyone?" "Talked to Marcus for a minute. Asked about the lot size. Marcus didn't know exactly, so the guy said, 'No problem,' and left this." Pete held out a business card. I took it. Commercial real estate. A firm I'd heard of, the kind that handled mid-size acquisitions. The man's title was senior broker. I turned the card over. Blank on the back. I set it on my father's desk next to the empty folder that still had his handwriting on the tab, and I looked at both of them together for a long moment. Ryan hadn't mentioned a real estate broker. Ryan hadn't mentioned a lot of things. But someone had sent one, and that someone had done on a Thursday morning while I was across town making a phone call Ryan had managed smoothly and said nothing true during. The name never came through. I called the number on the card Friday morning from my truck, parked behind a shop before anyone else arrived. A man answered on the second ring, professional and easy, the voice of someone who closed things for a living. I told him I was calling from the family. I didn't give my name. "Oh, great," he said, and I could hear him settling in. "Yeah, we're excited about this one. Good bones on the property. The location does a lot of the work. The walkthrough is booked for Tuesday, so we're right on track." "Tuesday," I said. Ryan mentioned the family is aligned, just finalizing things internally on Sunday. So we figured Tuesday gave everyone the weekend to get comfortable. A brief pause. "Is there something you needed to go over before then?" "I'm happy to walk you through the comps if that would help." "No," I said. "I just wanted to check where things stood." "All good on our end," he said. Looking forward to Tuesday. I sat in the truck after I hung up and watched Pete arrive and unlock the bay doors and start his morning the way he started every morning, the same sequence my father had watched from the same window for 30 years. Tuesday. Walkthrough booked. Family aligned. I drove to my mother's house that evening with a replacement bulb for her porch light, which had been out for 2 weeks and which I'd been meaning to get to. It was a real errand. I needed it to look like nothing else. She made tea while I changed the bulb, and I came inside and sat at the kitchen table and let her talk for a while about small things. A neighbor's wedding. Whether the soup had needed more salt. The way the house felt different at night now. When she'd settled, I asked her, gently, what she understood the shop to be worth. She named a number. I kept my face still. The number she named was roughly half of what the land alone was worth in the current market. And I knew the current market because I'd pulled comps 6 months ago when my father was still alive and we were talking about whether to refinance. "Ryan's being so careful not to pressure anyone," she said. "He keeps saying it's just information, that we don't have to decide anything we're not ready for." "That's good," I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator and the sound of the street outside. Then she looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look she used when she was carrying something someone had told her and wasn't sure she should pass along. "Ryan said you've been wanting to move on from the shop anyway," she said. Her voice was careful, gentle, the voice of someone repeating a confidence. That it's been too hard since Dad, and you've been thinking about doing something else. Is that true? I looked at her across the table. My mother, 61, tired, holding a mug of tea, repeating back to me a version of myself that my brother had constructed and installed at her kitchen before I got there. I'll talk to you Sunday, I said. She nodded like that was an answer. I kissed her on the forehead, told her the light would hold now, and drove home in the dark. Saturday night, I sat at my kitchen table with a beer going warm in my hand and tried to think it through straight. Going meant walking into a room where Ryan had spent 2 weeks building a version of events that didn't include me. It meant my mother watching her son's face off across her living room 6 months after she buried her husband. It meant giving Ryan exactly the scene he could point to afterward, the emotional one, the difficult one, the one who couldn't handle it. Staying meant letting a walkthrough happen on Tuesday for a building with my name on the incorporation papers, except the papers were gone, and a number my mother believed in that was half of what the property was worth, and a story about me that I hadn't told and wouldn't have told, and that was already living inside my family's understanding of who I was. I've been sitting there long enough that the beer wasn't worth finishing when my phone lit up. It was Sarah. A screenshot. No message attached, just the image. It was a text from Ryan, sent to her an hour earlier. Asterisk, Jason's in a rough place emotionally. He's not thinking straight about Dad's stuff. Best if we make the call Sunday and bring him in on it gently after. He'll thank us later. Asterisk. I read it once. I read it again. I read it a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what it was. It wasn't concern. It was a framework. Something to hand to anyone in that room who might hesitate. Look, Jason's struggling. He's not himself. We're doing this for him. Delivered the night before, so it had time to settle in before I could walk through the door and contradict it with my presence. He'll thank us later. I put the beer down. I picked up my phone and typed 2 words to Sarah and hit send. I'm coming. She replied in under a minute. A single line. I'll save you a seat. I went to bed early. Not because I was calm, but because there was nothing left to decide, and I wanted to be rested for the morning. The shop keys were on the counter by the door. The real estate card was in my jacket pocket. I made copies of every bank statement, every lease agreement, every document in that filing cabinet that hadn't been taken, and they were in a folder on the passenger seat of my truck. The incorporation papers were still missing. Ryan still had them, or someone he'd given them to did. That was a problem, but it wasn't Sunday's problem. Sunday's problem was simpler. I needed to be in that room. Everything else came after that. I was up before 6. I drove to the shop in the early gray of a Sunday morning when the street was empty and the traffic lights cycled through their colors for no one. I let myself in through the side door and walked through the dark bays without turning on the overheads, through the front office and into my father's office at the back. The fireproof safe was under the desk, built into the floor, the kind my father had installed when he first bought the building and never mentioned to anyone he didn't trust completely. The code was my mother's birthday, which was the code to everything my father considered worth protecting. Ryan had never worked in this office. Ryan had never had reason to know the safe existed. I crouched down and opened it. The duplicate incorporation papers were exactly where my father had put them. His handwriting on the top of the first page, the attorney's stamp, both signatures. Mine and his. I held them under the desk lamp and read through the key sections the way you read something when you need to be certain, not because you doubt it, but because certainty is what the morning requires. I folded them once and put them in my jacket's inside pocket. I stopped at Sarah's on the way. She lived in a small house 20 minutes from my mother's, and she answered the door, already dressed, coffee in hand, like she'd been up a while herself. I took the papers out and handed them to her without saying anything first. She set her coffee down on the entry table and read them. Then she went back to the top and read them again. "You told Mom you weren't on anything officially," she said. He said, "Dad never got around to restructuring it properly." "Dad got around to it 2 years ago," I said. "Tuesday afternoon. I was there." She looked at the papers one more time, then handed them back. Something in her face had gone from careful to decided. "I'm coming with you," she said. I was going to ask. She grabbed her keys off the hook by the door. We pulled into our mother's driveway at 1:58. Ryan's rental was parked in front, a silver sedan with a city plate. Behind it were two cars I didn't recognize, one a dark blue sedan, one a newer SUV. Not family cars. Nobody's aunt or uncle drove either of those. I sat for a moment looking at the house. The porch light I'd fixed Thursday was off in the daylight. The front curtain moved once. "Who do you think they are?" Sarah said. "Realtor, maybe. Possibly an attorney." He brought outside people to Mom's house. Yeah. I got out of the truck. Sarah came around from the passenger side and fell into step beside me. I put my hand to my jacket once, felt the fold of the papers through the fabric, and walked to the door. I didn't knock. I opened the door without knocking and walked in. The dining room was straight ahead, and I could see them before they saw me. My mother at the near end of the table with her hands folded in front of her. Ryan at the head of it, folder open, pen in hand, looking like a man running a meeting he'd prepared for. Two men in button-down shirts across from him. The realtor I recognized from the business card, and a second man with a legal pad who I didn't know, but could place easily enough. Ryan looked up, and his face stopped. Not long, maybe a full second, before the smile came back and he straightened in his chair. "Jason." His voice was easy, controlled. "I thought we agreed." "We didn't," I said. I walked to the table and pulled out the empty chair beside my mother and sat down. Nobody offered it. I didn't wait. The realtor was looking between me and Ryan with the careful expression of a man recalculating. I looked at him directly. "What's the walkthrough Tuesday for?" He glanced at Ryan. Ryan's expression didn't move. The realtor looked back at me. "The pre-listing inspection," he said. "Standard before we go to market." "Who authorized listing the property?" The lawyer looked at Ryan. It was a small movement, just the eyes, but it was enough. Ryan opened his hands. "We're just exploring options. It's not a done." I took the incorporation papers from my jacket and put them flat on the table and slid them across to my mother. "Mom, read the second page." She looked at me, then at the papers, then picked them up. The table was quiet. Ryan was still. I watched my mother's eyes move across the page, stop, move back, and stop again. Her face changed the way faces change when something they were told doesn't match something they're reading. She set the papers down and looked at Ryan. "You told me he had no ownership stake," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "You said your father never got around to it officially." "Those papers are informal," Ryan said. "The structure was never really. They appear properly filed." The lawyer said it without looking up from the document he'd reached across to examine. He said it the way lawyers say things they wish they didn't have to say. Stamped and registered. Both signatures witnessed. Ryan's jaw tightened. Sarah's voice came from the doorway behind me. I hadn't heard her come in. She read the message out loud. Ryan's text from Saturday night, word for word. Asterisk, Jason's in a rough place emotionally. He's not thinking straight about Dad's stuff. Best if we make the call Sunday and bring him in on it gently after. He'll thank us later. Asterisk. She read it clearly and without editorializing, and then the room was quiet. My mother's hand went to her mouth. Ryan looked at Sarah the way you look at someone who has just changed the shape of a room you thought you controlled. Then he turned back to me, and when he spoke, his voice had shifted into something harder and more direct. "You're being selfish," he said. "Mom needs the money from this. The estate has carrying costs. The shop isn't what it used to be, and you're going to sit here and block the whole thing because of your feelings. Dad would have wanted us to move on. He would have wanted Mom taken care of." I looked at him across the table. "Dad spent 30 years building something real," I said. "He'd have been ashamed of a son who tried to sell it behind his brother's back." The realtor had already started gathering his papers. He did it quietly, without making eye contact with anyone. The practiced movement of a man removing himself from something that had become none of his business. The lawyer capped his pen and stacked his legal pad and pushed his chair back. They were out the door in under 10 minutes. I heard the two unfamiliar cars start up and pull away, and then the house was just us. Ryan sat back in his chair and tried to find a different angle. He looked at our mother and softened his voice and said he'd only been trying to protect her, that he'd been carrying all of this alone for months, that someone had to think practically. My mother listened to all of it. Then she said, "Ryan, I need you to go home." She unfolded her hands on the table and looked at him steadily. "Not here. Home. To the city. I need some time." He started to respond. "Please," she said. He closed the folder. He picked it up and pushed back his chair and looked at me once more, and whatever he'd planned to say with that look he kept to himself. He kissed our mother on the top of her head, and she let him, and he walked out. The front door closed. Ryan was on a flight Monday morning. By Tuesday, the calls had started. An aunt on my father's side. A cousin I hadn't spoken to since the funeral. One of my father's oldest friends, a man named Gerald who'd known our family since before I was born. All of them calling to ask some version of the same question, wrapped in concern, careful and slightly rehearsed. Whether I was doing okay, whether the grief had been hard, whether I understood that Ryan had only been trying to help. I knew the shape of it. Ryan was good at this. He'd had 2 days and a phone and a story where he was the one who'd been trying to hold things together until his younger brother walked into a family meeting uninvited and made a scene in front of their grieving mother. I didn't argue with any of them. I just said I was fine and let them go. Sarah handled it without asking me first. She sent the screenshot to every person Ryan had called. No explanation, no argument, just the message and a single line. Asterisk, this is what he said the night before the meeting. Decide for yourselves. Asterisk. By Thursday, the calls had stopped. Gerald called back. Actually, not with a careful question this time, but just to say he'd seen the message and that Walt would have been glad I was there Sunday. I didn't tell him how much that meant. I just said thank you and meant it. Friday afternoon, I was in the back office going through invoices when I heard the front door. My mother stood in the bay entrance in her coat, handbag over her arm, looking at the space the way you look at a place that holds more than it shows. Pete saw her from under a hood and straightened up and said her name quietly, and she smiled at him with a smile that cost her something. I came out, and she looked at me, and I walked over, and she held on for a long moment without saying anything. I brought her into the office. My father's desk, his lamp, his filing cabinet with its handwritten labels. She stood in the middle of it and looked at all of it, and then she sat in his chair and cried. Not loudly. The quiet kind that comes from somewhere deep and old and doesn't need an audience. I sat across from her and let her have it. After a while, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked around the room again, differently this time, taking it in rather than being taken by it. "Walk me through the books," she said. "Mom, you don't have to." "I want to." She straightened in the chair. "I should have asked you these questions a long time ago. Both of you. I should have sat down with your father and understood what this place actually was." She looked at the filing cabinet. "I'll let Ryan explain it to me because he used words I recognized and I was too tired to ask for the real version. That's on me." I pulled the current ledger from the drawer and opened it on the desk between us and started from the beginning. Revenue, expenses, the lease, the equipment notes, the pension contributions I'd kept up for Pete and Marcus and the others because my father had made a commitment and I intended to keep it. She asked questions, real ones, not polite ones. She wrote things down in the small notebook she always kept in her handbag. We were there for 2 hours. When we were done, she closed her notebook and looked at the desk and then at me. "He trusted you with all of it," she said. "Yeah," I said. "He did." She nodded once, slowly, like something was settling in a place that had been loose for a while. 6 months after that Sunday, the shop was still open. I hired a 4th mechanic in October, a young guy named Darius who reminded me a little of myself at that age. Showed up early, asked good questions, didn't need to be told twice. The bays were full most days. The books were the healthiest they'd been since before my father got sick, and I knew that because my mother now understood the books well enough to tell me. She came on Wednesdays, brought lunch, sat in the office, asked about customers by name because she'd been listening closely enough to know them. She'd ask about the Henderson's truck or whether the fleet account had renewed, and I'd answer and she'd nod and write something in her notebook, and it felt like the version of things that should have existed years earlier and was only now finding its shape. The sign I repainted in September. My father had hand-lettered it himself in 1994, and 30 years of weather had done what 30 years of weather does. I had it restored by a woman who did historic sign work. Same font, same colors, same name. The morning she finished, I stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a long time. Pete came and stood beside me and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. Sarah drove up once a month with her kids. They were 7 and 4 and completely serious about the plastic tools she'd bought them. And they'd spend an hour in the bays with Marcus pretending to diagnose things while Sarah sat in the office with coffee and asked how I was doing in the way that meant she actually wanted to know. She never brought up Ryan unless I did. I mostly didn't. Ryan and I hadn't spoken since he walked out of our mother's house. At Christmas, he sent her a card. Not me. I noticed that and sat with it for a day or two, and then I bought a card to send back and held it in my hand and decided I didn't know the performance. There was nothing in me that wanted a paper over what had happened with a signed card and a return address. Maybe that would change. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, I wasn't going to pretend my way toward it. What I owed my father wasn't something I could put in an envelope. It was the shop. Open. Honest. The accounts clean. The staff paid fairly. The customers treated the way he'd treated them for 30 years. That was the debt, and I paid it every morning when I pulled into the lot and unlocked the front door and turned the sign from closed to open and started the day. Some mornings I'd stand in the bay before the others arrived, and it would be quiet enough that I could almost hear the place the way it used to sound when he was in it. The particular way he moved through a space, unhurried, certain, like a man who knew exactly where he belonged. I knew where I belonged. I locked up every night and came back every morning, and that was enough. That was the whole answer. There's a thing that happens when you spend years showing up for something and someone tells you that you don't count. You start to wonder if they're right, not because they are, but because they said it with enough confidence and you were tired enough to hear it. I stopped wondering on a Sunday afternoon when I put a piece of paper on a table and let it speak for itself. My father taught me to do the work and keep the receipts. Turns out that applies to more than just the shop. I'm over at where silence ends. Have you ever had to walk into a room you were told to stay out of just to protect something that was already yours?